Start. So good morning everyone. So today we are going to see basis and rationale of biochemical tests in different diseases. So today we are going to see diabetes mellitus, myocardial infarction, jaundice, liver diseases and thyroid diseases. So to understand the importance of biochemical tests in different diseases, we have to understand the biochemical defect in that particular disease. So to understand the biochemical defect, we have to understand the normal biochemical mechanism which is happening in the healthy individuals. Okay? Because in a disease, the biochemical mechanism will be affected and physiological function will be affected, and due to which the patient will get the symptoms and he will come to us. So we know when biochemical in any disease, when there is defect in the biochemical mechanism and defect in the physiological functions, the patient will be getting the signs and symptoms and he will come to us. We'll see the general examination and systemic examination. We'll decide which system is affected and we'll come to a provisional diagnosis. After that, we'll send the patient to the investigations and we'll come to the final diagnosis and we'll give the treatment. This is the basic pattern which is followed. So coming to the today's topic, diabetes mellitus. So diabetes is a disease in which there is defect in the insulin production by the pancreas or defect in the insulin response by the peripheral cells, which leads to impairment in the carbohydrate metabolism and finally leads to elevated levels of blood glucose. So coming to the basic mechanism, we know the food that we take contains more amount of carbohydrates. So these carbohydrates go along the buccal cavity, esophagus, stomach, and finally small intestine. We know most part of the digestion of carbohydrates takes place in the small intestine. So digestion means conversion of complex food particles to the simpler particles is digestion. So here the carbohydrates are converted to monosaccharides like glucose, galactose and fructose, most commonly glucose. So after digestion, these monosaccharides which are present in the lumen of the small intestine are absorbed. So here is the absorption. So this is the lumen of the intestine. So this is the lumen of the intestine and this is the epithelial cells, that is the lining of the intestine, and this is capillary. Capillary is nothing but small blood vessels which are attached to the intestinal wall. Okay. So from the lumen, the monosaccharides, mostly glucose, enters the epithelial cells through sodium GLUT transporter 1 and GLUT transporter 5. They enter the epithelial cells, and from the epithelial cells, they enter the capillaries through glucose transporter 2. So after entering the capillaries, these glucose and other monosaccharides will reach the all cells of the body, the peripheral cells of the body. And they enter the peripheral cells through glucose transporter 4. Okay. Then these glucose transporter 4 are always in a closed state. Then how this glucose transporter 4 are opened, which are present on the peripheral cells of the body. So insulin. Insulin is the key which when attaches to the peripheral cells, there will be conformational change on the membrane and this glucose transporter 4 will be opened and glucose enters the cell. So here you can clearly see the insulin comes and attaches to the insulin receptors which are present on all the peripheral cells of the body, and due to this there will be conformational change on the membrane of the peripheral cells. Due to this conformational change, the glucose transporter 4 will be opened and glucose enters the cells, all the cells of the body. So where we are getting this insulin from? So we know pancreas, the beta cells will get the insulin. So when the glucose levels after digestion and absorption, the glucose levels will be increased in the blood. These glucose will reach the pancreatic cells and enter the pancreatic cells. So in this picture you can see they will enter the pancreatic cell, and this leads to depolarization and insulin is released. Okay, so when glucose is increased in the blood due to digestion and absorption, this glucose reaches the pancreatic cells and it leads to depolarization, and which leads to release of the insulin from the insulin vesicles from beta cells of pancreas. So this insulin reaches all the cells of the body and makes the glucose transporter 4 open. So here you can see the insulin will make the glucose transporter 4 open, and all the glucose enters the peripheral cells of the body. So the entry of glucose into the peripheral cells is known as glucose uptake. Okay. And after entering the peripheral cells, we know what happens. The glucose undergoes glycolysis, in which glucose is converted to pyruvate, lactate, and finally energy is released in the form of ATP. So this is the normal mechanism that is happening in a healthy individual. Then what happens in diabetes? So in diabetes, there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. In type 1 diabetes, the defect is the insulin production. So here you can see the into mark. So the main defect in the type 1 diabetes is insulin production. So there is no insulin production. So the glucose 4 transporters can't be opened. So the glucose cannot enter the individual cells, the peripheral cells. So that's why the glucose level will be increased in the blood, leading to hyperglycemia. And the other type of diabetes is type 2 diabetes. Here the defect is in the glucose transporter 4. So here you can see the into mark. So the defect is in the glucose 4 transporter. So the insulin is released normally. The insulin comes and attaches to the peripheral cells normally, but the glucose 4 transporters won't be opened. So because of this, the glucose can't enter the cells and the glucose will be accumulated in the blood, which leads to hyperglycemia. So in both cases, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, the glucose levels are increased in the blood, leading to hyperglycemia. So when glucose is not entering the blood, what happens? So there is no glucose, no glycolysis, no energy. So the patient becomes weak and patient comes to us with different complaints. So when the patient comes to different complaints, we will diagnose the diabetes by different biochemical parameters. Okay. So random blood sugar. The sugar levels measured at any point of time in a day is random blood sugar. And fasting blood sugar, the sugar levels measured after 10 to 12 hours fasting is fasting blood sugar. And PPBS, postprandial blood sugar, the sugar levels measured 2 hours after a meal is postprandial blood sugar. Okay. And oral glucose tolerance test is a special test which is standard test for diagnosis of diabetes. And HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin, it is nothing but when glucose combines with hemoglobin, it leads to formation of glycated hemoglobin or HbA1c. It is used to check the control of diabetes. Hope everyone is clear. So these are the normal values, less than 140 and FPS is 70 to 110, PPBS less than 140 milligram per deciliter. And HbA1c is 4.0 to 5.4 is the normal range. That means in normally also hemoglobin combines with glucose to form HbA1c, but that is up to 5.4% of the total hemoglobin. Whereas in diabetes, as the glucose levels are increased, more and more glucose combines with the hemoglobin to form more HbA1c. That's why HbA1c levels crosses 5.4 in a diabetic patient. And this HbA1c is used to check the control of diabetes. And OGTT you had already seen. It is a special test in which we will give 75 grams of glucose mixed in 300 ml of water in a fasting state to the patient. And after that, the blood and urine samples are collected in the fasting state and 1 hour and 2 hours after the glucose load. So this is a standard test for diagnosis of diabetes. And coming to the levels of GTT, fasting level less than 110 milligram per deciliter is normal, and fasting levels greater than 126 milligram per deciliter is diabetic. Similarly, 2 hours post load less than 140 is normal, and greater than 200 milligram per deciliter is diabetic. And the levels in between are considered as impaired glucose tolerance. It is a state of pre-diabetic state. This is the interpretation of GTT, depending upon which we will diagnose the diabetic patient. And these are the other tests, other biochemical tests to check the complications of the diabetes. See, for any disease, the first line of investigations are meant for diagnosis of the disease, and the other investigations are meant for to check the complications of the disease. So the first line of investigations are always for diagnosis of the disease, and the remaining tests to check the complications of the disease. So these are the other biochemical parameters which are necessary to check the complications in the diabetes. So all the sugar levels are measured in semi-auto analyzer or fully auto analyzer, and mostly by the enzymatic methods. If the diabetes is not diagnosed at an early stage, it leads to many complications like nephropathy, retinopathy, neuropathy, and stroke, heart attack, all these things. So that's why the diabetes should be diagnosed at an early stage and it should be treated. And treatment includes lifestyle modification and medications or insulin depending upon the levels of the patient. And after the treatment starts, and again for follow-up also, we'll check the biochemical parameters like FBS, PPBS, and HbA1c. That is known as follow-up. Follow-up after the treatment. So for understanding, a patient comes to OPD with weakness, increased frequency of urine. His blood reports of OGTT shows the fasting levels. Blood sugar is 116 milligram per deciliter and urine sugar is nil. And 2-hour blood sugar is 154 milligram per deciliter and urine sugar is nil. Then what is the conclusion from the above report of OGTT? So here we can see the fasting blood sugar levels is 116. So we know below 110 it is normal and above 126 it is diabetic. So it is in between. Similarly, 2-hour post-load glucose, the blood sugar is 154 milligram per deciliter. We know less than 140 is normal and more than 199 is diabetic. So this is also in between. So the patient is not a diabetic and he is not even a non-diabetic, and the patient has impaired glucose tolerance. He is in impaired glucose tolerance condition, which is a pre-diabetic condition. So another case, a 60 years old patient comes to OPD just for routine checkup without any symptom. So his RBC, the random RBS, the random blood sugar levels is 162 milligram per deciliter. Then what should be the next step? So diagnose as diabetes, send for FBS, PPS, send for GTT, and repeat RBS. So as he's an old patient and his RBS levels are high, we can send the patient to the oral glucose tolerance test to confirm whether he is diabetic or not. Okay. So that is about the diabetes. And coming to the myocardial infarction. So this is decreased blood supply to the heart due to blockage of blood vessels. Commonly it is known as heart attack. So coming to the basic thing, we know that heart supplies blood to all parts of the body, but heart also needs supply of blood, and the heart is supplied mainly by 3 vessels: the right coronary artery, left circumflex, and left anterior descending artery. So this is the basic thing that is happening. And in some risk factors like age and family history and all other risk factors, the blood vessel supplying the heart will undergo atherosclerotic changes. So due to which the plaques are formed and the plaques rupture and clots are formed and the blood supply to the heart is blocked, which leads to myocardial infarction or heart attack. So in this picture, you can see the atherosclerotic changes, that is formation of plaque at different stages. And this plaque, when ruptures, it leads to the formation of clot. And when the clots are formed, the blood supply to the heart is blocked. So here clearly you can see a part of the vessel supplying the heart is blocked due to formation of plaques. Then what happens is the area that is supplied by this blood vessel is infarcted. Okay, there is infarction on the area which is supplied by this blood vessel. Okay, myocardial infarction, that is the tissue in that area will be dead. The muscle in that area will be dead. That is myocardial infarction. And the patient comes with the symptoms. And we will diagnose the patient depending upon different biochemical parameters. So these are the biochemical parameters or cardiac biomarkers for myocardial infarction. Troponin I, creatine phosphokinase, lactate dehydrogenase, aspartate transaminase, and myoglobin. These are the cardiac biomarkers. So coming to the troponin, we know the muscle contraction in the heart requires actin, tropomyosin, and troponin complex. So the troponin complex contains troponin I, troponin C, and troponin T. So when there is blockage to the blood supply to the heart muscle, then that muscle will be damaged. So due to the damage or due to the injury, this troponin I is released into the blood. And we will measure this troponin I to confirm the diagnosis of myocardial infarction. So this troponin I is nothing but a myocardial muscle protein which is released into the bloodstream after the injury or myocardial damage. This troponin I, the importance of this troponin I is it is very specific indicator for myocardial infarction. That means the troponin I is increased only in myocardial infarction. The increase of troponin I in other conditions is very rare. And this follows a pattern. It rises after 4 hours of onset of MI and it peaks at 24 hours. And again, it comes to normal level in the blood after 7 to 10 days after myocardial infarction. And the normal range is 0 to 0.4 Ng per ml. And CPK, creatine phosphokinase. This is another enzyme which converts creatine to creatine phosphate. So this creatine phosphate is a rapidly mobilizing donor for high energy phosphate. It is a reservoir for the high energy phosphate which is required for the synthesis of ATP. So this creatine phosphate is also present in the heart and it is having the same function in the heart also. So when there is any damage to the heart muscle cells, this creatine phosphokinase is also released into the bloodstream. And we will estimate this CPK and diagnose the cardiac infarction, myocardial infarction. So this also follows a pattern. It rises some 3 to 6 hours and peaks at 24 hours and elevated for 2 to 3 days. So here the important thing is it is rises from 3 to 6 hours. That is, it is being raised completely at an early onset. Okay, 3 hours. Whereas troponin, we are seeing it is rising after 4 hours, but here it is rising in 3 hours. In the normal ranges is 50 to 100 and 10 to 80 units per liter in males and females. And AST is another enzyme which aspartate transaminase. We know the transaminases convert one amino acid into the another amino acid. So the conversion of the amino acid is needed for synthesis of non-essential amino acids. And moreover, the excess of amino acids are diverted for the production of energy. So this conversion of interconversion of amino acids is done by the transaminase. So aspartate transaminase is also such an enzyme which is present in the heart and which has the same function in the heart. And when there is any damage to the heart, this aspartate transaminase is released into the bloodstream. We will estimate the enzyme in the bloodstream and we will confirm the diagnosis of the MI. It rises in 6 to 12 hours, peaks at 48 hours, and it remains elevated for 4 to 6 days after myocardial infarction. The normal range of AST is 12 to 38 units per liter. And LDH is also another enzyme which is necessary for conversion of lactate to pyruvate, and we know this step is necessary for production of energy. So this LDH is also released into bloodstream when there is injury to the myocardium or heart muscle. And we know why there is injury to the heart muscle, because of blockage of blood supply to that particular part of the muscle. And we know why there is blockage, due to atherosclerotic changes and formation of plaque. Okay. And why there is atherosclerotic changes, we know because of different risk factors. And this also follows some pattern, rises 24 to 48 hours and peaks at 72 hours and elevated for 5 to 10 days. The normal range being 50 to 200 international units per liter. Myoglobin. Myoglobin is, we know myoglobin is like hemoglobin with single chain. We know that. This is also released into the blood after the injury. But this is not specific for myocardial infarction. Myoglobin can also be released into blood in other conditions also. So depending upon myoglobin, we can't confirm the diagnosis of MI. And moreover, it rises within 1 or 2 hours only. But as this is not specific for myocardial infarction, we won't consider it as the standard diagnostic tool for MI. And it peaks for 6 to 9 hours and elevated for 1 day. And here you can see the different cardiac biomarkers, how they are varying with the time after onset of myocardial infarction. Okay, we know myoglobin is the first it will be rising and the first it will come to the normal level. But myoglobin, as it is not specific for myocardial infarction, we won't consider it as a standard diagnostic tool. And troponin I also it rises a little bit early, and it is more specific for the MI. So that's why we'll consider troponin I as the standard diagnostic tool. And coming to other investigations for confirmation of diagnosis, clinical manifestations. Of course, we know clinical manifestations are the first indications for approach to the diagnosis. And apart from that, biochemical cardiac markers and ECG and cardiac imaging all are done for confirming the diagnosis. And for understanding purpose, a middle-aged patient comes to OPD with chest pain and sweating after 4 hours of onset of pain, that is chest pain. So what should be the first choice of investigation in the cardiac markers? So here we know the myoglobin is not specific for MI, and troponin I is very specific for MI, and it is the first investigation of choice. And moreover, in this case, you can see the patient is coming after 4 hours. So troponin levels will be raised after 4 hours, that we know. So that's why troponin I is the choice of investigation in this case. So the next disease is the jaundice. What is jaundice? Jaundice is, hope everyone is clear. So jaundice is yellowish pigmentation of skin, sclera and mucosa due to increased plasma bilirubin. So due to increased plasma bilirubin, there will be yellowish pigmentation, that is known as jaundice. Then coming to the basics, where we are getting this bilirubin from? We know that RBC will be lysed in 120 days. So after 120 days, due to lysis of RBC, hemoglobin is released into the blood. And this hemoglobin is broken down into heme and globin. And by the degradation of this heme, we will get the bilirubin. The bilirubin that we are getting by the degradation of heme is unconjugated bilirubin or indirect bilirubin, which is not attached to any conjugates. Okay, that is unconjugated bilirubin or indirect bilirubin. This unconjugated bilirubin combines with the albumin and transported to the liver. Inside the liver, this unconjugated bilirubin is conjugated with glucuronides and forms conjugated bilirubin or direct bilirubin. Conjugated bilirubin is also known as direct bilirubin. So this conjugated bilirubin reaches the small intestine through the biliary system, that is bile duct, and in small intestine this conjugated bilirubin by the action of bacterial proteases is converted to urobilinogen, and this urobilinogen is excreted in the feces as stercobilin and is excreted in the urine as urobilin. So this is the normal process that is occurring. Okay, we are getting the unconjugated bilirubin from RBC, hemoglobin from heme, and this is being conjugated in the liver, and this is transported to small intestine through bile duct, and in small intestine it's converted to urobilinogen and excreted as stercobilin and urobilin through feces and urine. And depending upon the level of defect, the jaundice is divided into hemolytic, hepatic, and obstructive. So jaundice is nothing but increase in this bilirubin levels. So depending upon the level of defect, the jaundice is divided into hemolytic, hepatic, and obstructive. In hemolytic jaundice, the defect is in the production itself. Okay, so normally bilirubin is produced by hemolysis, but in some diseases like malaria and sickle cell anemia, more hemolysis occurs, more RBC will be lysed, so more heme is released and more unconjugated bilirubin is released. So this is hemolytic jaundice, in which more unconjugated bilirubin will be there, which leads to jaundice, hyperbilirubinemia or jaundice. And in case of hepatic jaundice, there is damage to the liver cells. So this can be occurred in viral hepatitis or cirrhosis of the liver. There is damage to the liver cells. Here the production of the bilirubin is normal. So the bilirubin production is normal. It reaches the liver, but due to damage in liver cells, the liver cannot handle the bilirubin. It cannot completely conjugate the bilirubin. Some part it will conjugate and some parts remains accumulated. So in this way, the indirect bilirubin will be accumulated in the blood, as the liver cannot handle completely the bilirubin. It cannot conjugate the bilirubin completely. So some part of indirect bilirubin will be accumulated in the blood. And coming to conjugated part, the liver conjugates some part of the bilirubin, but that bilirubin can't reach the small intestines because the conjugated bilirubin in the liver damage, the liver cells will be inflamed and edematous. So they will block, they will obstruct the flow of the conjugated bilirubin to the intestines. So in this way, the indirect bilirubin and direct bilirubin both are increased in this hepatic jaundice. The indirect bilirubin is increased because the liver cannot manage, that cannot conjugate all the bilirubin produced because of liver cells damage. And as the liver cells are damaged because of inflammation and edema, this creates a blockage to the conjugated bilirubin to pass to the intestines. So both direct and indirect bilirubin are increased in the hepatic jaundice. And coming to post-hepatic jaundice, here the production of bilirubin is normal and the conjugation of the bilirubin in the liver is normal, but this conjugated bilirubin cannot go to the intestine because of blockage in the bile duct. This can happen in the gallstones or tumors. So as there is blockage to the direct bilirubin or conjugated bilirubin, in the case of obstructive jaundice, the direct bilirubin or conjugated bilirubin will be more increased. Okay. So the patient, when there is increase, so in all the case of jaundice, the bilirubin levels will be increased and patient will come to us with the symptoms, and will confirm and differentiate, classify the jaundice depending upon the biochemical parameters. So total bilirubin, direct bilirubin, aspartate transaminase, alanine transaminase, and alkaline phosphatase are done in the blood, and urine bile salts, bile pigments, and urobilinogen are checked to confirm the jaundice and to classify the jaundice. So these are the normal ranges 0.2 to 1.0 and 0 to 0.3 milligram per deciliter for total and direct bilirubin. And indirect bilirubin we can calculate by subtracting direct bilirubin from the total bilirubin. And coming to enzymes, AST, ALT and ALP, the normal ranges are 12 to 38, 7 to 41 and 33 to 96 units per liter. And all the serum levels of the liver, about the jaundice, all the parameters are analyzed by or estimated by analyzers, and the urine levels are estimated by the multi-strips. And we had already seen the estimation by individual tests of bile salts, bile pigments, and urobilinogen by Hayes test, Fortis test, and Ehrlich's test. Coming to interpretation. So in all types of jaundice, the bilirubin will be increased. The total bilirubin will be increased. Okay. So when it is above 1 milligram per deciliter, it is known as latent jaundice. And when it is above 3 milligram per deciliter, it is known as clinical jaundice. That is, when the bilirubin levels are more than 3 milligram per deciliter, it is clinical jaundice. The patient can feel the symptoms. So coming to the interpretation of bilirubin, the total bilirubin we know increased in all types of jaundice, and indirect bilirubin is increased in hemolytic jaundice, because we know the basic defect in the hemolytic jaundice is production of more bilirubin. So that's why indirect bilirubin is increased in the hemolytic jaundice. And coming to hepatic jaundice, we know both direct and indirect bilirubin are increased in hepatic jaundice, because some part of bilirubin is not managed by the liver, so indirect is increased, and some part which is conjugated can't be transported to the intestine due to edema and inflammation of the hepatic cells. So both indirect and direct bilirubin are increased in case of hepatic jaundice. And coming to direct jaundice, the obstructive jaundice, the direct bilirubin is increased, because here all the bilirubin produced by hemolysis is conjugated. But this conjugated bilirubin can't enter the intestine. So at that level it is blocked. So that's why direct bilirubin is increased in case of obstructive jaundice. And coming to the enzymes, this AST, ALT are present in the liver cells, more in the liver cells. So in case of liver disease, we will see the hepatic jaundice. So in case of liver disease, there is damage to the liver cells, and liver cells will be damaged, and the enzymes which are present in the liver cells, that is AST and ALT, are released into the bloodstream, and we will estimate it in case of hepatic jaundice. We can come to the conclusion that hepatic jaundice when there is increase in AST and ALT. And coming to ALP, alkaline phosphate, it is present in the biliary tract. So when in obstructive jaundice, we know the defect is in the biliary tract. So when there is damage to the cells of the biliary tract, the cells will get damaged and ALP will be released into the bloodstream. So that's why if ALP is increased, we can confirm the classification as obstructive jaundice. Okay. Because remember, AST and ALT are present in the liver cells. That's why in liver damage, they are released into the blood, which happens in the hepatic jaundice. And ALP is present in the biliary tract cells, and when there is any damage to the biliary tract cells, these are ALP is released into the blood, which happens in the obstructive jaundice. So in this way, depending upon the direct and indirect bilirubin and AST, ALT and ALP levels, we can differentiate the types of jaundice. And in hemolytic jaundice, the enzymes won't be increased, because the defect is not in the liver and not in the biliary system. The defect is in the hemolysis. So that's why in hemolytic jaundice, the enzymes won't be increased. And coming to urinary findings, we'll see the urobilinogen, bile salts and bile pigments. And the urobilinogen is more increased in the hemolytic jaundice, and bile pigments are more increased in the obstructive jaundice. So depending upon this, we can classify the different types of jaundice. And after classification of jaundice, we have to see the underlying cause also, because we'll classify the jaundice depending upon the biochemical parameters. But for treating the patient, we have to see the underlying cause, for which we'll combine these biochemical tests with the imaging techniques and other kit methods to finalize the underlying cause. So after knowing the underlying cause, we'll treat the hyperbilirubinemia and also the underlying cause. So for understanding, a patient comes to OPD with yellowing of sclera and skin. His blood reports show the total bilirubin is 1.8 milligram per deciliter, direct is 0.3 milligram per deciliter, and AST is 21, ALT is 24, and ALP is 74 units per liter. So what could be the probable classification of jaundice? So here clearly you can see the normal range of total bilirubin is 0.2 to 1.0. So here it is 1.8, that is total bilirubin is increased. And direct bilirubin normally 0 to 0.3, this is normal. And AST, ALT, ALP all are in the normal ranges. So it implies that AST, ALT are normal means there is no liver damage. ALP is normal means there is no obstruction, not obstructive jaundice. And AST, ALT not hepatic jaundice. And only total bilirubin is increased. Direct is also not increased. So this happens only in the hemolytic jaundice. Okay. If it is a case of hepatic jaundice, then the direct bilirubin is increased. If it is a case of obstructive jaundice also, direct bilirubin is more and more increased. So as there is no increase in the direct bilirubin, only total bilirubin is increased. That implies indirect bilirubin is increased. So that's why this is the case of hemolytic jaundice. And next, coming to the liver diseases. And liver diseases is just the parameters that we'll see, that we had seen in the jaundice, the same parameters. Liver function tests are done to see different liver diseases. So the liver function tests are total bilirubin, direct bilirubin, AST, ALT, ALP, and apart from that, total protein and albumin are also seen in the liver diseases, because we know the most of the protein metabolism occurs in the liver only. So that's why in liver diseases, the protein metabolism will be damaged, will be abnormal. So that's why we'll check the total proteins and albumin. And we know AST, ALT, ALP are the enzymes which are present in the liver. So in liver damage, they will be increased. And total bilirubin and direct bilirubin, we know the quantity of total and direct depends upon the conjugation in the liver. If there is any liver disease, then there will be change in the total and the direct bilirubin level. So that's why these are all the parameters in the liver function test. We'll check in the liver diseases. So we know there is a pattern for liver disease from normal to cirrhosis. Normal liver becomes steatosis, hepatitis, and cirrhosis. So all these stages can be checked by liver function tests. And there are many liver diseases. The liver damage can be acute liver damage or chronic liver disorders or alcoholic hepatitis or cirrhosis or bile duct obstruction or the cancer of liver which is coming from the other organs or the cancer of liver which is starting in the liver itself and some autoimmune diseases. So in all these diseases, the different parameters in the liver function test will be varying. All the bilirubin, the enzymes like AST, ALT and ALP and the total protein and albumin all will be changing as per the disease affected, different liver diseases. So depending upon this, we can come to a conclusion and diagnosis of different diseases of the liver. Not only the biochemical parameters, but also we'll combine with the other imaging techniques and the other tests to confirm many liver diseases along with the biochemical parameters. So next is the thyroid disease. So we know thyroid gland will produce T3 and T4, and this T3 and T4 are used for necessary for the metabolism and growth and development of the body. Okay. And we know how the thyroid is synthesized. We had already seen in the previous classes. The iodide, which is present in the blood, comes to colloid and becomes iodide, and it combines with the tyrosine to form monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine. This monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine combines to form tri and tetraiodotyrosine. Okay, that means T3 and T4. So these T3 and T4 are present in the thyroglobin in the colloid, and depending upon the necessity, this T3 and T4 are released into the blood. Okay, this is the normal mechanism, and this T3 T4 is stored for several months, and it is released in the body depending upon the necessity by the stimulation of thyroid stimulating hormone. So by endocytosis, this T3 and T4 are released into the blood. And we know the control of production of T3 and T4. The T3 and T4 are produced by thyroid gland, which is controlled by TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced by anterior pituitary, and the production of TSH is controlled by TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is released from the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is feedback control. You know how the production of T3 and T4 are controlled. So this is the normal mechanism that is happening. So coming to diseases, if there is any defect in thyroid gland or defect in the pituitary gland or defect in the hypothalamus, then there will be variation in the production of T3 and T4. If T3 and T4 are decreased, it is known as hypothyroidism. If T3 and T4 are increased, it is known as hyperthyroidism. And due to this hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, that means the increased and decreased levels of T3 and T4, there will be disturbance in the metabolisms of the body. So due to this disturbance in the metabolism, the patient will get different symptoms and signs. So these are the signs of hypothyroidism, and these are the signs of hyperthyroidism. So when there is defect in the metabolisms due to defective production of T3 and T4, the metabolisms will be affected, which leads to signs and symptoms in the patient. Due to these signs and symptoms, the patient will come to us and will diagnose the patient by different biochemical parameters. So these parameters are T3, T4, TSH, and free T3 and free T4, which are nothing but a part of T3 and T4, which are unbound to the proteins, and thyroglobin. And apart from this, anti-thyroid peroxidase antibodies, anti-thyroglobin antibodies, and anti-TSH receptor antibodies. So these antibodies are also measured because in some autoimmune diseases, the autoantibodies are produced, which will destroy the thyroid gland, which will destroy itself the thyroid gland. So that's why these antibodies are checked in some thyroid disorders. Okay, and apart from this, this TSH and TRH is also measured to see the integrity of hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis, whether all are functioning properly or not. Okay. So these are the biochemical parameters to diagnose the disorders of thyroid gland. So these are the methods for measuring the thyroid hormones, and most commonly chemiluminescent immunoassay is used for estimation of thyroid hormones. Coming to T3. T3 is triiodothyronine. The normal range is 80 to 180 nanogram per deciliter, and this is increased in case of hyperthyroidism, and this T3 is decreased in case of hypothyroidism. Okay, and T3, only T3 is increased in thyrotoxicosis. Okay, thyroid toxicosis. In that case, T4 is normal. So any increase in T3 or T4 is hyperthyroidism. Okay, but only when T3 is increased, it is thyroid toxicosis. And coming to T4, T4 also same thing. T4 is increased in the hyperthyroidism, and T4 is decreased in the hypothyroidism. The normal range of T4 is 4.6 to 12 microgram per deciliter. So in any hyperthyroidism, we know T3 and T4 are increased, and in any hypothyroidism, T3 and T4 are decreased. So apart from that, the increase in T3 denotes increase in total thyroid binding protein, and decrease in T4 denotes decrease in the thyroid binding protein and thyroxine binding protein and non-thyroid illnesses. Okay. And coming to TSH, we know TSH is not secreted by the thyroid gland, but it is secreted by the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland. So this TSH is reverse. In hypothyroidism, the TSH levels will be increased, and in hyperthyroidism, the TSH levels will be decreased. Okay. The normal range of TSH is 0.5 to 5.5 microunits per ml. So TSH normal range, and if TSH is decreased, here in this case we can see that TSH is increased in hypothyroidism, that is known as primary hypothyroidism, and here you can see that TSH is decreased, which is known as primary hyperthyroidism. And in between, if the levels are in between, it is known as a mild symptomatic hypothyroidism or subclinical hypothyroidism. This is the TSH, about TSH. And FT3 and FT4, free T3 and free T4. These are nothing but it is a part of T3 and T4 which is not bound to any proteins. So T3, T4 are generally bound to the proteins. And this free T3 and T4 are that part of the T3 and T4 which are not bound to any proteins. Because as they are not bound to any proteins, they are independent of the binding proteins. They are more reliable for the diagnosis of thyroid diseases. So in case of borderline values of T3 and T4, we'll use the free T3 and free T4, that is FT3 and FT4 for the diagnosis of different thyroid disorders. So the normal range are 1.7 to 4.2 and 0.8 to 1.8 nanogram per deciliter. So apart from this, for seeing the integrity of hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis, we'll check the TSH and TRH. If T3, T4, TSH are can be the values of the T3, T4, TSH can be changed when there is any defect in the anterior pituitary or hypothalamus. So that's why we'll check the TSH and TRH levels also. And also in some other thyroid disorders, we'll check the antibodies. So antibodies against thyroperoxidase and thyroglobulin are estimated in case of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and autoantibodies against the TSH receptors are checked in the case of Graves' disease. And we know antibodies, they are produced in autoimmune diseases which destroy the thyroid gland itself. And after treatment, after knowing whether it is hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, we will give the treatment for hypo and hyper, and we will also diagnose the underlying cause, and we will give the treatment for the underlying cause. And again for the follow-up also, we will see the levels of T3, T4 and TSH. After medication for 3 months or 6 months, we will give the follow-up by checking the levels of thyroid profile, that is T3, T4 and TSH. So these are the cases of thyroid disorders, hypothyroidism. This is myxedema, and this is exophthalmos. And for understanding, a patient comes to OPD for general checkup without any symptoms. His thyroid report shows as follows. T3 is 96 nanogram per deciliter, T4 is 8.2 microgram per deciliter, TSH is 6.2 microunits per ml. So what is the diagnosis? So here you can see the T3 is 96, which is in the normal range, and T4 is 8.2, this is also within the normal range, and TSH is 6.2, this is just above the normal range. So we had already seen the primary hypothyroidism means the level should be greater than 20, but here the levels are in between the normal and 20. So that's why he is not hypothyroid or not hyperthyroid, because in hypothyroid means the levels will be less than 0.05. In hyperthyroidism, the levels will be more than 20. So that's why it is in between. So this patient is can be diagnosed as subclinical hypothyroidism. So this is the diagnosis. So these are my references, and these are the useful websites. Hope everyone is clear. Thank you.